The glass hit the floor at 12:47 a.m., 13 minutes before Anne Brinkman's quarterly numbers would confirm what she already knew, that Gloria's was untouchable, profitable, hers. Now the February wind was eating through the hole in her front window, scattering napkins like white flags across the herringbone tile, and Anne stood perfectly still behind the bar, not from fear, but from the particular, or ice-cold clarity that comes when you realize the threat you've been quietly preparing for has finally arrived. Her hand didn't shake. Not once. She set down the profit report, pressed both palms flat against the cool mahogany, looked at the brick sitting in the wreckage of her grandmother's hand-blown glass and thought, Fred Yoder just made the last mistake he's going to make on my block. The only problem was, she hadn't figured out how to make that true yet. She had 60 days. Maybe less. Though Fred didn't file injunctions. He filed insurance claims on buildings that hadn't burned down yet. Her lawyers were good. Her lawyers were expensive. But her lawyers didn't own the street corners at 2 a.m., and they couldn't stop a grease fire from looking like an accident. Money she had. Time was bleeding out on the floor with the broken glass. That's when she heard the footsteps, deliberate, unhurried, crunching through the wreckage of her front door. Not running, not skulking, not walking. Like a man who'd already decided the outcome of every room he'd ever entered. He was tall in a way that reorganized the space around him, dark-haired, dressed in a white shirt that had no business looking that composed at midnight. Tattoos mapped the full length of his left arm, ink so intricate it looked architectural, and his eyes, when they finally found hers across the dim dining room, held the specific, exhausted expression of a man who was tired of what he was and hadn't yet decided what to become. He stopped at the edge of the debris, looked at the brick, looked at her. Anne looked back and didn't move an inch. "You're bleeding," he said. His voice was quiet. That was the thing she'd remember later, how quiet it was. Not soft. Quiet the way a held breath is quiet. She glanced down. A shard had caught her forearm at some point. She hadn't felt it. "I'm aware," she said. "You're Jeremy Garrett." Something shifted almost imperceptibly behind his eyes. "And you," he said, "are the only person in this city my uncle is actually afraid of." He reached into his jacket, slowly, deliberately, with the careful movements of someone who understood exactly how threatening he looked, and set a check on the bar beside her quarterly report. The number had 7 figures and his family's name on it. She didn't look at it. "I'm not selling." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, like he'd been hoping she'd say exactly that. "I'm not buying." He finally stepped over the broken glass and crossed the room toward her, and Anne held her ground the way she always held her ground, completely, expensively, at great personal cost. "I'm proposing." Outside, the city hummed its indifferent, glittering hum, 12 floors of skyline, pressing cold light through the fractured window. Somewhere across town, Fred Yoder was waiting for a phone call that would tell him Anne Brinkman had finally cracked. She picked up a clean linen napkin, pressed it to her arm, and listened. Anne had heard the proposal. Now she needed to hear the rest of it. She kept the linen pressed to her forearm and moved behind the bar with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had run a kitchen, a floor, and a staff of 22 for the better part of a decade. She poured 2 glasses of water. Not wine, well, not whiskey, and set one in front of Jeremy Garrett without asking. A small thing, a deliberate one. This was still her establishment, broken window and all, and hospitality was not something she performed. It was something she was. He noticed. She could tell by the way he didn't comment on it. "Sit," she said, and gestured toward the nearest stool. He sat, which surprised her more than she let show. The Glorias smelled the way it always did at closing, warm garlic and wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of the candles she'd just snuffed, the wax still cooling in its little brass cups along the windowsills. Her grandmother had brought those cups from a market in Savannah, Georgia, 23 years ago. They had survived 2 recessions, a pandemic, and a full kitchen renovation. They were not going to survive Fred Yoder. Not if she let him keep going. "Your uncle gave me 60 days to vacate," she said, informally, through a man who smelled like cigarettes and left a coffee ring on my best corner table. Jeremy's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "That sounds like Fred. I have lawyers, good ones, based out of Chicago. They tell me I have a strong case." She set down the linen and looked at the cut on her arm, shallow, already clotting. "They also tell me that a strong case takes 18 months and that Fred Yoder has never once waited for a verdict." "He won't wait," Jeremy confirmed. No hesitation, no softening. She respected that. Outside, a car rolled slowly down the block, its headlights sweeping briefly through the broken window and across the far wall where her grandmother's photograph hung. Gloria Reeder, aproned and laughing, standing in this exact doorway on the day the bistro first opened. Anne did not look at the photograph. She didn't need to. She felt it the way you feel a scar you've stopped noticing, except in cold weather. "Tell me what you're actually offering," she said. Jeremy turned the water glass once in his hands, deliberate, thinking. "My family holds controlling interest over every major development contract between here and the Ohio border. Fred wants this block because a syndicate port here gives him independence from my side of the operation. If I'm married, legally, publicly, with this address as the registered marital residence, his petition to seize the property collapses. He can't dissolve an asset tied to the Don's household. Without a vote he won't win. And you need a Don's marriage to take the title. I need a wife and an heir within the year. Those are the terms the families recognize." Anne was quiet for a moment. The refrigerator hummed behind the kitchen door. Somewhere down the block, a truck rumbled past, probably running deliveries to the restaurants along the Milwaukee Avenue Strip, the city moving in its usual, indifferent rhythm, while she stood in the ruins of her front window and weighed the shape of her own future. "The bistro stays operational," she said. "Full autonomy. I run my floor, my kitchen, my staff. No interference, no Garrett men on my payroll, no laundered reservations." He nodded once. "My staff gets a protected trust. 1 million. Liquid, till accessible regardless of what happens to either of us." She watched his face for resistance and found none. "And if this arrangement ends, for any reason, I walk away with the deed to this building in my name, free and clear." Jeremy looked at her for a long moment. Not the way Fred's man had looked at her, like an obstacle, but with something closer to recognition, like he was reading a contract and finding it surprisingly well drafted. "You prepared these terms before I walked in," he said. "I prepared them 6 weeks ago," Anne said. "When the first threatening letter arrived, I didn't know it would be you offering the solution, but I knew someone would eventually come through that door with leverage, and I intended to be ready." Something moved across his expression then, not quite admiration, though it lived in the same neighborhood. Something quieter, more complicated. He picked up the check he'd set on the bar and tucked it back into his jacket. "I'll have the formal contract drawn up by Thursday. My attorney is in Indianapolis, discreet, no family ties. Mine will review it. I'd expect nothing less." He stood, buttoned the single button of his jacket, and looked around the dining room one last time, at the candle cups, at the broken glass still scattered across the tile, at the warm amber walls her grandmother had chosen, because she said they made everyone look like they were worth loving. "One more thing," Anne said, before he reached the door. He turned. "The Heir clause." She held his gaze without flinching. "We negotiate that separately." And for the first time since he'd walked through her broken window, Jeremy Garrett had no immediate answer. The estate sat 12 miles outside the city, tucked behind a tree line so deliberate it had clearly been planted as a wall by someone who understood that privacy, at a certain level of wealth, was not a luxury, but a survival strategy. Anne had driven herself, which Jeremy's security team had not expected and could not stop. She arrived on a Tuesday morning with 2 rolling suitcases, her laptop bag, and the particular posture of a woman who had decided to treat this as a business relocation, and nothing more. She was not going to let it feel like retreat. The house was beautiful in the controlled, intentional way of a man who had grown up surrounded by ugliness and taught himself to want the opposite. Clean lines, warm stone, tall windows that looked out over the kind of manicured grounds you found on the better estates along the Virginia countryside or the quieter roads outside Nashville. Inside, it smelled like cedarwood and something faintly citrus, a diffuser, she suspected, or chosen by someone on staff rather than Jeremy himself. It was the smell of a house that was maintained, not lived in. Her rooms were on the east wing. She set up her laptop on the writing desk within 20 minutes and had her Chicago lawyers on a call within 30. By noon, she had redirected her morning supplier deliveries through her floor manager, Diane, approved a weekend reservation list, and reviewed the contractor estimate for the broken front window back on the block she was no longer permitted to sleep on. Not permitted. She pressed her fingertips against the desk and breathed through that particular word until it stopped feeling like a cage door closing. Jeremy appeared in her doorway just after 2, not knocking, which she noted, but stopping at the threshold, which she also noted. "Fred's coming tonight," he said. "Dinner, but he doesn't know you're here yet." "Then tonight's going to be interesting," Anne said, and closed her laptop. Fred Yoder arrived at 7. He was not what she'd expected, which she suspected was precisely the point. He was trim, silver-haired, dressed in the kind of unremarkable blazer that men wore when they wanted to seem like accountants. His voice, when he greeted Jeremy in the front sitting room, was warm and avuncular, and the voice of a man who coached Little League in a previous life and used that memory like a costume. He saw Anne and went very still in the way that powerful men go still when they encounter something they didn't authorize. "Fred," Jeremy said, with a neutrality so practiced it was almost its own language. "This is Anne Brinkman, my fiancée." Fred looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled. "The bistro owner." "Gloria's," Anne said pleasantly. "We've been on the Chicago Tribune's top dining list 3 years running. You should make a reservation sometime, though I understand the waiting list is quite long." Something shifted behind Fred's eyes. Not anger. Recalibration. Over dinner he tried 4 times. She counted. The first was a compliment, her business acumen, how impressive it was, how unusual. The kind of compliment designed to remind a woman that she was surprising in a field where she should have been ordinary. As Anne received it with a smile and steered the conversation to commercial property valuations in the Milwaukee Avenue corridor, citing 3 specific comparable sales from the last fiscal quarter. By the time she finished, Fred was the one who looked like he'd wandered into a field he didn't know. The second was a suggestion, gently floated, That managing a bistro and managing an estate were perhaps different demands, and perhaps she had considered whether a quieter life might suit her eventual transition. My grandmother opened Gloria's when she was 51, Anne said, refilling her own water glass without waiting for staff. After raising 2 children and running a catering operation out of her kitchen in Savannah, I think the women in my family are reasonably comfortable with demanding schedules. The third was a question about the property, pure provocation, asking whether she'd had any recent security concerns at the bistro, with the particular innocence of a man who already knew the answer. Anne looked him in the eye and said she had, in fact, recently had a window replaced. Terrible thing, she said. Probably the weather. The fourth he didn't finish. He looked at her across the table, past the candles, past the good crystal, past the careful staging of this new arrangement, and whatever he'd been about to say, he swallowed it. Dinner ended cordially. Fred kissed her hand at the door, which was the most honest thing he'd done all evening, because it was pure theatre, and they both knew it. When the car disappeared down the private drive, Anne stood in the entrance hall and listened to the quiet of the house settle back around her. As Jeremy appeared at her left shoulder, he said nothing for a long moment. "He'll try a different angle tomorrow," Anne said. "He will," Jeremy agreed quietly. She turned and found him watching her with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet, something unguarded and not entirely comfortable with itself. "Get some rest," he said finally, and walked away down the hall. Anne looked after him, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the question wasn't about Fred. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't, kindly check if you haven't, and tap the subscribe button so you don't miss my next story. By the end of her first week at the estate, Anne had established a rhythm that would have impressed even her most disciplined line cook. 6:15. Up and dressed before the house stirred. 6:40. First call with Diane, who was running the floor at Gloria's with the competent ferocity of a woman who had been quietly ready for more responsibility for years and was now receiving it in one concentrated flood. 7:30. Supplier negotiations, conducted from the writing desk in the East Wing, while the grounds crew moved silently outside the tall windows, raking the gravel paths that curved through the property with a precision that reminded her, inexplicably, of a hotel she'd once visited in Savannah, the kind of place where every visible surface existed to communicate that someone cared deeply about the impression it made. She understood that impulse completely. The estate's kitchen was a point of quiet friction. It was a professional-grade space, 8-burner range, a la Manche hood, at the kind of French copper pots that hung decoratively in lesser kitchens, but here showed the faint interior staining of actual use. And it was staffed by a cook named Douglas, who had trained somewhere in the Pacific Northwest and treated the space with a solemn, territorial reverence that Anne recognized immediately as the mark of someone who had never had to share their domain. She didn't displace him. She simply arrived on Wednesday morning, asked where he kept the shallots, and began reducing a stock that had been simmering on the back burner for reasons that were entirely her own. Douglas watched her from across the island without speaking. "I cook when I'm problem-solving," she said, without looking up. "I won't touch your mise en place." He handed her a wooden spoon and went back to his prep work. By the time Jeremy appeared in the kitchen doorway at 8, drawn presumably by the smell of something better than his usual breakfast, and a quiet détente had been established, he looked at her, then at the pan, then back at her. "I didn't know you cooked," he said. "I grew up in a restaurant kitchen," Anne said. "What did you think I did there?" He accepted the small bowl she handed him without ceremony, leaned against the counter, and ate, standing up. or something in that detail lodged in her chest briefly. The image of a man who had a formal dining room with seating for 20 and ate breakfast standing at a kitchen counter like a person who had never quite learned how to take up comfortable space in his own house. She filed it away and said nothing. The real complications came that afternoon during a joint call that Jeremy's operations manager, a terse, efficient man named Grayson, based out of their satellite office in Charlotte, North Carolina, had scheduled to walk through the family's public-facing investment portfolio. It was a cover structure, Anne understood, but an intricate one. She had been invited to sit in as Jeremy's fiancée, visible but presumably decorative. She lasted approximately 9 minutes in that role. That Nashville hospitality acquisition is bleeding cash because the management contract has no performance triggers, she said, before she could stop herself. What, you're paying a flat fee regardless of occupancy rate? Any restaurant owner in the country will tell you that's how you fund someone else's complacency. Grayson stopped mid-sentence. Jeremy turned to look at her from the head of the table with the same expression he'd worn on the night of Fred's dinner. That unguarded, not entirely comfortable look. Except this time there was something else running underneath it. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like relief. And after the call, the house went quiet in the particular way that large, well-staffed homes go quiet, not empty, but held, every surface absorbing the day's accumulated weight. Anne was standing at the window in the study when Jeremy came to find her, and for a while neither of them spoke. Outside, the last light was going out over the tree line, the sky shifting through a grey that reminded her of Chicago in late November, that specific colour that meant the year was turning serious. "How many people rely on you?" he asked eventually. Not casually, like he'd been carrying the question for a while. She thought of Diane, of the line cooks, the servers, her grandmother's photograph hanging in a bistro she currently could not go home to. 22, she said, plus their families. Jeremy was quiet for a moment. I have 47. Not a competition, a comparison. The difference was important. Anne turned to look at him and found that he was already looking at her with an expression she didn't have a category for yet. Something that lived in the narrow, complicated space between understanding and longing. "We should talk about the public appearances," he said finally. "Yes," she agreed. Neither of them moved to start that conversation. The first appearance was a charity gala at a hotel ballroom in downtown Indianapolis. Neutral territory, as Jeremy explained it, or chosen specifically because the Garrett name carried weight there without the raw, contested charge it carried in Chicago. The rival families would be watching. Fred's people would be watching. Everyone in that room would be measuring the distance between Jeremy and Anne with the particular, practiced eye of people who had built their livelihoods on reading what others were trying to hide. They rehearsed in the study the night before. It felt, at first, like blocking a scene in a play neither of them had fully auditioned for. Jeremy showed her how he would place his hand at the small of her back when steering her through a crowd. Present but not possessive, he explained, because possession looked like performance, and performance was the one thing they couldn't afford. She showed him that she already knew how to move through a room. "Thank you," and had been doing so since she was 19 years old, helping her grandmother work a full dining floor during a New Year's reservation rush. "I'm not teaching you to walk," he said, with the closest thing to patience she'd heard from him. "I'm teaching you to walk with me." That was a different thing. She acknowledged it with a nod and let him try again. The second time his hand settled against her back, she didn't tense. The third time, she almost forgot to notice. By the fourth pass across the study floor, something in the careful architecture of the exercise had shifted, though neither of them commented on it, the way you don't comment on a door swinging open in a room you thought was sealed. The gala itself was a different kind of pressure, warm and loud and smelling of hothouse flowers and the particular woody sweetness of expensive bourbon being poured liberally across a room full of people pretending to be interested in a pediatric hospital fundraiser while conducting the actual business of the evening in clusters near the bar. Anne wore deep burgundy, which she had chosen deliberately, or a nod to the red silk of her bistro's signature tablecloths that no one in the room would understand except her. It was a private anchor. She needed one. Jeremy found her at the edge of the reception area and did not compliment her appearance, which she appreciated more than she expected to. He simply offered his arm and she took it, and they walked into the room together like two people who had been walking into rooms together for years. They were good at it. That was the unsettling part. Oh, she laughed at the right moments. He touched her elbow when redirecting a conversation, instinctively, naturally, as though the gesture had been calibrated over a long period of genuine partnership. A man named Harlan, silver-haired, Texas accent, or the kind of wide handshake that implied he'd built something with his hands before he'd bought things with other people's, watched them for a full 10 minutes from across the room before approaching to introduce himself as a regional associate of the Garrett family business. His eyes moved between them with the slow, measuring quality of an appraiser. "You seem settled," he said to Jeremy, but he was still looking at Anne. "We are," Jeremy said simply. Later, during the dinner service, Jeremy leaned close to say something about the seating arrangement, a logistical aside, nothing more, and the warmth of his breath against her ear produced a response she was wholly unprepared for. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a sudden, unwelcome awareness of how close he was, and how long it had been since closeness had felt like anything other than a professional variable to be managed. She reached for her water glass. He didn't move away immediately, and she didn't ask him to. And the 3 seconds that passed in the space between those two facts said something that neither of them had agreed to say. On the drive back, they were quiet in the way of two people processing the same problem from opposite sides. The Indianapolis skyline fell away behind them, the highway opening into the dark, flat reach of rural Indiana, stars beginning to appear in the gaps between cloud cover, the way they never quite did over the city. Harlan believed it, Anne said eventually. Not everyone believed it, Jeremy said. A pause, the kind that has a shape to it. "That's either very good," she said, "or it's a problem." Jeremy's hands stayed steady on the wheel, but something in his jaw shifted. A small, involuntary movement that she realized with some discomfort, already learning to read. "I haven't decided which," he said. Neither had she. The date had been circled on no calendar Anne owned, but she had been aware of it for weeks, the way you are aware of a storm system moving in from the west, not visible yet, but present in the quality of the air, in the particular way her chest tightened each morning when she opened her eyes in the East Wing bedroom and remembered, freshly, exactly where she was and why. The 30-day window in the air clause closed at midnight. She dressed carefully, which was itself a kind of confession. Not in the burgundy she'd worn to Indianapolis, and not in anything that announced an occasion, just a simple ivory blouse, soft at the collar, the kind of thing she might have worn to a quiet dinner in her own bistro on a slow Tuesday. Armor that didn't look like armor. She had been assembling that particular wardrobe her entire adult life. Jeremy's room was on the west end of the estate, and the walk down the long corridor felt longer than its actual distance in the way that all walks toward something irreversible do. The house was quiet. While Douglas had long since finished in the kitchen, leaving behind the faint residual warmth of the oven and a faint smell of rosemary from whatever he'd prepared for dinner. The grounds outside the tall windows were dark, the tree line invisible, the sky a deep and starless charcoal. She knocked once. He opened the door as though he'd been standing near it. For a moment they simply looked at each other across the threshold. Two people who had spent 4 weeks constructing a careful professional architecture between themselves, and who both understood, without saying so, that the architecture was about to be tested in a way contracts and rehearsed appearances had not prepared either of them for. "Come in," he said quietly, and stepped back. The room smelled like cedarwood and clean linen. A single lamp was on in the corner, throwing a low, warm light across the space. She noticed he hadn't staged anything. No candles, no gesture toward occasion. It looked like a room where a person simply lived, and that absence of performance steadied her fractionally. She sat on the edge of the chair near the window, not the bed, and folded her hands in her lap. "We don't have to talk through the terms again," she said. "We both know them." "I know," Jeremy said. He didn't sit. He stood near the foot of the bed with his hands in his pockets, watching her with that careful, unreadable quality she'd come to recognize as him thinking harder than his face was willing to show. "Anne." She looked up. "You're holding your breath," he said. She was. She released it slowly, deliberately, and that small, involuntary exposure cost her something. Oh, she felt it go, a thin outer layer of the composure she'd been maintaining since she walked through the broken glass of her own bistro window and decided to meet whatever was coming without flinching. "I've run a business since I was 24, she said, and her voice stayed even, which she was proud of. "I've negotiated with suppliers who tried to take advantage of me, and city planners who didn't want to see me succeed, and a banking institution in Atlanta that told me a woman my age had no business applying for a commercial loan." A pause. "I've managed every part of my life with a reasonable degree of competence." "I know that," Jeremy said, gently. "I haven't." She stopped, started again. "This specific thing. I haven't." She met his eyes then, because she wasn't going to look away from the truth she'd just placed in the room. "I don't know how to make that sound less significant than it is, so I'm not going to try." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind that forms when someone has said something true and the other person is taking the full weight of it seriously, rather than rushing to fill the space with reassurance. Jeremy crossed the room slowly and crouched down in front of her chair, bringing himself below her eye level with a deliberateness that she understood immediately was intentional. He was making himself smaller so she wouldn't have to. He didn't reach for her hands. He simply waited until she looked at him. "Then we're not doing this tonight," he said. She blinked. "The clause is a piece of paper," he said, "and you are not a transaction." Something moved through her chest then, sharp and quiet and entirely unwelcome in its intensity, or the feeling of a door she'd bricked over a long time ago developing, without her permission, a crack of light at its edge. "Jeremy." Her voice was smaller than she intended. "Get some sleep," he said softly. He stood and touched her face, just briefly, just his fingertips at her jaw, the most careful thing anyone had done to her in longer than she could honestly account for. "We'll figure out the rest." He walked her to the door, and Anne stood in the corridor alone, took the house quiet around her, and understood with absolute clarity that the contract they'd signed 6 weeks ago in the clean transactional language of mutual survival had just become something neither of them had negotiated for, She wasn't sure yet whether that made her feel safer or more exposed than she'd ever been in her life. It was, she suspected, both. She found the contract on the kitchen island the next morning. Not the full document, just the Heir clause. Was the single page that Grayson's office had drafted in the clean, bloodless language of legal obligation, the one that had sat in the back of Anne's mind for 6 weeks, like a stone in a shoe she'd decided to simply walk with. It was sitting beside the coffee carafe, a small, deliberate placement that told her Jeremy had been up before she had, and had made a decision before she'd had the chance to weigh in on it. He was standing at the far end of the kitchen island when she came in, though still in last night's shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, holding a lighter. He looked up at her, waited. She looked at the page, then at him. "You're certain?" she said. Not a question, exactly. More the kind of statement that holds space for the other person to reconsider if they need to. "I was certain at approximately 2 in the morning, Jeremy said. "I've had several additional hours to confirm it." She nodded once, slowly. The coffee was already brewed, and she poured herself a cup before she answered, because some responses deserve the length of a small ritual. "All right," she said. He lit the corner of the page and held it over the deep farmhouse sink, and they both watched the Heir clause consume itself in about 11 seconds, the paper going amber, then brown, then a brief, bright edge of orange, before it collapsed into a curl of ash against the white porcelain. Though the smell of it was faint and chemical and final, neither of them spoke until it was fully gone. "The clause was the family's requirement, not mine," Jeremy said, setting down the lighter. "My claim to the Don's seat rests on the marriage itself and my operational control. I have attorneys in 3 states who can make that argument hold." He looked at her steadily. "Fred doesn't need to know the distinction." Anne wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and considered the shape of what he was offering. Not just the protection, which had been the original transaction, but the renegotiated terms underneath it. He was absorbing the risk of a weakened legal position to spare her something that had never been his to demand in the first place. The recognition of that sat in her chest with a warmth she didn't fully trust yet. "What we tell him it was fulfilled," she said. "We tell him exactly that. And when there's no child forthcoming." "Pregnancies fail," Jeremy said, with a quiet directness that held no cruelty, just the pragmatic fluency of a man who had spent his life navigating systems that required uncomfortable truths to be spoken plainly. "It happens. We grieve appropriately. Fred gets a 6-month window of uncertainty, which is 6 months we use to dismantle his operational leverage from the inside." It was, Anne thought, a very good plan. She would have arrived at something similar herself, given enough time and slightly less complicated circumstances. "He'll want to see us," she said. "Hear it from both of us in the same room." "He's coming Friday. I've already arranged it." Of course he had. She almost smiled. Fred arrived on Friday afternoon with the punctuality of a man who used timeliness as a form of dominance, and a Tennessee bourbon he'd brought as a gift, which was the kind of offering that was simultaneously generous and territorial. He set it on the sideboard in the sitting room and looked at the two of them with the patient, watchful quality of a man accustomed to finding the thread that would eventually unravel a story. Anne sat beside Jeremy on the sofa. Close, but not performing closeness, just the natural proximity of two people who had stopped calculating the exact distance between themselves. She told him herself, quietly, directly, with the particular stillness of a woman delivering private information she would rather keep private, which was the most convincing performance she'd ever given, because it required almost no performance at all, just a steadiness of voice and a single glance downward at her hands. Fred's expression moved through something she clocked and catalogued instantly. Surprise, recalculation, and beneath both of those, the faintest shadow of something that was not happiness for them, but was, unmistakably, defeat. "Well," he said, after a moment. He lifted the bourbon in a small gesture that was technically a toast. "That changes the board." "It does," Jeremy said. Later, after Fred's car had cleared the drive and the house had settled back into its particular quiet, Anne stood at the sitting room window and heard Jeremy come to stand behind her. "He didn't believe all of it," she said. "No," Jeremy agreed. "But he believed enough." A pause. Outside, the late afternoon light was doing something gentle across the grounds, the kind of light that exists briefly at the edge of seasons. Ohio had been sending cold mornings and warm afternoons all week, the weather unable to commit, or the year holding its breath between what it had been and what it was about to become. "The 6 months," Anne said. "We use them well." "We will." She turned then and found him closer than she'd measured, and something in his expression had shifted from the strategic clarity of the last hour into something quieter and considerably more difficult to categorize. His hand moved, barely, the smallest gesture toward her. And then his phone rang from the hall table, sharp and insistent. And the moment folded in on itself before either of them had decided what to do with it. Jeremy stepped back, answered the call, and by the sound of his voice when he said Grayson's name, tightly controlled, suddenly grave, Anne understood that the 6 months they'd been counting on had just encountered its first complication. Grayson's complication, it turned out, though it had been a financial one, a series of flagged transactions in the Charlotte office that required Jeremy's attention for the better part of 3 days, and left Anne largely to herself in the estate, running Gloria's remotely with the focused intensity of a woman who understood that staying useful was the best antidote to feeling powerless. She was on a call with Diane on a Thursday morning, reviewing a new seasonal menu she'd been building in the margins of her notebooks, when Diane went quiet mid-sentence. "Anne." Diane's voice had changed, stripped of its usual brisk efficiency, replaced by something careful and low. "There's a fire." The word landed in her sternum before her mind fully processed it. "What?" "The kitchen. They're here. The trucks are here. I got everyone out. Everyone's out. But Anne, the kitchen..." She was already moving. Or Jeremy found her in the entrance hall, pulling on her coat with the mechanical focus of someone operating past the point where feeling was useful. He had been on his way back from the study when he heard her voice in the hall, and something in the quality of it, not loud, not broken, just compressed to a kind of terrible efficiency, stopped him in the doorway. "The bistro," she said, not looking up from her buttons. "Fred." He didn't ask questions. He had the car moving in 4 minutes, but the drive into the city felt longer than it had ever been, the Chicago skyline assembling itself through the windshield with agonizing slowness, while Anne sat in the passenger seat and looked straight ahead and did not speak. Jeremy didn't fill the silence with reassurance. He understood, in the particular way of a person who had spent his life protecting things, that comfort offered before someone has seen the damage is its own kind of condescension. He let her be what she needed to be right now, which was entirely inside herself. They smelled it before they turned onto the block, acrid and thick, the particular wrongness of smoke from a commercial kitchen. Not wood smoke or something seasonal, but the heavy, black-edged smell of equipment burning, of a space that had been designed to produce warmth being consumed by it instead. Anne made a sound that was not quite audible when they rounded the corner, and she saw the trucks. Or the front of the building was standing. That registered first, and it was something. The arsonist, Fred's arsonist, because there was no other possible reading, had targeted the kitchen specifically, the rear of the building, the copper pots, and the 8-burner range, and the French hood that Douglas polished on Sundays, with a reverence that had always quietly moved her. The fire crews had it mostly contained, but the damage was done in the way that kitchen fires do their damage. Not always in walls and ceilings, but in the irreversible, intimate destruction of the surfaces and tools that made a working kitchen what it was. Diane met them at the barrier tape. Her eyes went to Anne with the specific helplessness of someone who loves their employer and cannot fix what's in front of them. Anne ducked under the tape before anyone could stop her. Jeremy followed without hesitation, because he was not going to let her stand in the wreckage of her grandmother's kitchen, alone, contract or no contract, strategy or no strategy. She stood in the doorway of the gutted kitchen and looked at it for a long time. The copper pots, Gloria's copper pots, brought up from Savannah, survivors of 2 recessions and a pandemic and everything else the years had sent, were warped and blackened on their hooks, the ones that hadn't fallen. The range was ruined. The walls were the color of a wound. It smelled of ash and water and the ghost of every meal that had ever been prepared in that space. She didn't cry. She stood perfectly still, and the stillness itself was the most devastating thing Jeremy had ever witnessed, because he understood it now, understood it at the specific frequency of his own loneliness, at the way that people who carry 22 or 47 others on their backs learn to absorb grief standing upright because there is never a safe moment to put it down. He moved to stand beside her. Not in front, not offering an arm or a hand or anything that required her to accept it. Just beside her, shoulder close to shoulder, the way she had said 6 weeks ago that she didn't need someone to carry the weight for her. She needed someone to stand, shoulder to shoulder. He understood now what he should have recognized weeks ago. Somewhere between the Indianapolis highway and a burned air clause, and a woman who said 22 the way other people said family, that what he felt when he looked at Anne Brinkman had long since stopped resembling strategy. "The brass cups," she said finally, her voice even and very quiet. From the windowsills. He looked. 2 of the small brass candle holders her grandmother had brought from a Savannah market were on the shelf above the pass-through, untouched, still holding their last inch of cooled wax. He walked to the shelf, lifted them down carefully, and placed them in her hands. Anne closed her fingers around them and pressed them against her chest, and the breath she exhaled was the kind that has been held for a very long time. Jeremy looked at the burned kitchen, at her hands, around her grandmother's brass cups, at the woman who had walked through broken glass 4 weeks ago without flinching, and was now standing in a new kind of wreckage, with her spine still straight and her eyes still open. And he understood with absolute, irreversible clarity that protecting her bistro was no longer about the contract. It had not been about the contract for some time. "He wants you to break," Jeremy said. His voice was quiet, but underneath the quiet was something with an edge that had not been there before. "He needs you to walk away so I look exposed." Anne looked up at him. "I'm not walking away," she said. "I know." He held her gaze. "Neither am I." Behind them, Diane appeared in the ruined doorway with a clipboard and red eyes, and the particular expression of someone ready to begin making lists. Because that was what you did when the thing you loved was damaged and still standing. You made lists, or you started again. Anne looked at her, then back at the kitchen, then at Jeremy. Something had shifted in the way she was looking at him. A hairline adjustment, the smallest recalibration. And he felt it, the way you feel a change in barometric pressure. with the part of you that tracks weather before the sky gives anything away. "We need to call your lawyers," she said. "All 3 states." Already texting Grayson. "And Jeremy?" He looked at her. Whatever you're planning for Fred," she said. "I want in the room when it happens." They had 10 days. That was how long it took Anne's Chicago lawyers, working in concert with Grayson's Charlotte office, and a forensic accountant Jeremy retained out of a firm in Atlanta, to trace the full architecture of Fred Yoder's illicit financial network. The shell companies nested inside legitimate development holdings, the port contracts paid through a Nashville-based logistics front, or the municipal bribery channels running quietly beneath 3 different city comptroller offices across the Midwest. It was meticulous, patient, ugly work, and Anne drove most of it from the estate's dining room table, which had been converted into a war room without ceremony and without apology. She had asked to be in the room. Jeremy had kept that promise. The picture that emerged across those 10 days was not of a man who was simply ruthless. And Fred Yoder was infrastructural. He had built himself into the city's financial skeleton so deliberately that removing him carelessly would damage the surrounding tissue. That was his protection, and he knew it. Courts moved slowly. Judges weighed consequences. Fred had spent 30 years making himself too expensive to prosecute. Anne found the thread on day 8. It was a commercial real estate holding company registered in Delaware, a state whose incorporation laws were a favorite of people with things to obscure, that served as the clearinghouse for 3 of Fred's largest illicit revenue streams. The company had a single point of vulnerability, a revolving credit facility backed by a consortium of private lenders, not one of whom was a hospitality investment group that Anne had done business with twice in the last 4 years, when she'd explored expansion financing for Gloria's. She knew their compliance officer personally. More importantly, she knew their compliance officer was meticulous, principled, and deeply averse to the kind of reputational exposure that came from holding collateral on a criminal enterprise. She made the call herself. It took 40 minutes. When she set the phone down, she looked at Jeremy across the table and said, "The credit facility gets a formal compliance review starting Monday. It will not survive the review. Without it, the Delaware Holding Company cannot service its debt obligations. Fred loses access to approximately 60% of his liquid operational capital within 30 days. Jeremy looked at her for a long moment. "That's the financial side," he said. "That's the financial side," she confirmed. He nodded once, slowly, and picked up his own phone. The confrontation happened on a Saturday at a private social club in a Chicago neighborhood that had been Garrett family territory since before Jeremy was born. Dark wood paneling, the smell of leather and old tobacco, and decades of quiet, consequential conversations, the kind of place where powerful men had always assumed the walls absorbed their decisions without judgment. Fred arrived expecting a negotiation. Jeremy had not invited him to negotiate. Anne was not in the room for what followed. That had been Jeremy's condition, stated plainly and without room for debate, and she had accepted it with the understanding that there were lines of work that belonged to each of them separately, and that demanding to cross all of them was not partnership. It was something closer to distrust. She waited in the car with Grayson, who did not make small talk, which she respected. She heard later, was in the careful and edited account that Jeremy gave her that evening, that Fred had entered the room with his usual armored confidence and exited it a fundamentally diminished man. What Jeremy said to his uncle in that room, she did not press for in full, but she understood from the quality of Jeremy's voice when he described it, and from the particular exhaustion in his face afterward, or that he had said things that had been true for a long time and had simply been waiting for a moment that justified the cost of saying them. What she knew concretely, Fred Yoder signed over his operational interests in the contested development blocks by Sunday afternoon. His position within the Garrett family structure was formally reduced by a vote of the associate families, decalled by Jeremy with the procedural precision of a man who had prepared for that vote long before the bistro fire gave him cause to call it. By Monday morning, when the compliance review of the Delaware Holding Company was formally initiated by the lender's legal team, Fred's ability to rebuild what he'd lost had been preemptively dismantled. It ended, as the most complete victories do, not with a single decisive blow, but with the quiet, comprehensive closing of every available door, Jeremy told her on the drive home. The city moved past the windows, Michigan Avenue lit up in the early evening, Lakeshore Drive curving north toward the neighborhoods, where both of them had separately built the lives that had eventually, improbably, brought them to the same table. When he finished, Anne was quiet for a while. "It holds?" she asked. "It holds," Jeremy said. "The families won't move against us. Not now. Fred has no leverage left, and no allies willing to absorb the cost of backing him." She nodded. Outside, Chicago did what Chicago did, kept moving, indifferent and magnificent, all lit glass and cold lake wind, and the particular energy of a city that had weathered worse than this without pausing to acknowledge it. "The bistro," she said. "Contractors can start assessment next week. Whatever it costs." "I'll pay for the kitchen," Anne said, and her voice carried a finality that was not about money. "It's my kitchen. I'll rebuild it." Jeremy didn't argue. That was one of the things she had learned to rely on, that he understood the difference between an offer of help and an encroachment on the thing a person needed to do themselves. "Then I'll pay for everything else," he said simply. She turned to look at him, and found him watching the road with that expression she had spent weeks learning to read, the one that lived in the narrow territory between what he meant and what he was willing to say directly. The car turned off the highway toward the estate. The contract between them was gone. The Heir clause was ash in a farmhouse sink. The war, for all practical purposes, was over. And yet, sitting in the quiet of the moving car with the city receding behind them, Anne was acutely aware that the most unresolved thing between them had nothing to do with Fred Yoder or syndicate politics or a bistro on the most contested block in Chicago. Jeremy's hand rested on the console between them, still, quiet, not reaching. She looked at it for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she looked back at the road and said nothing. Yet. The contractors started on a Wednesday. Anne was there when they arrived. They're standing on the sidewalk outside Gloria's with a coffee she'd made at the estate before dawn and driven into the city with, because she had wanted to arrive before anyone else. She had wanted the first quiet minutes alone with the building, with the fact of it still standing, its front intact, its grandmother's photograph still on the wall where the smoke hadn't reached, as its brass candle holders sitting on the east windowsill where Jeremy had placed them after she brought them home from the wreckage, wrapped in a dish towel. She had not cried in the kitchen the night of the fire. She allowed herself, in the grey 6 o'clock stillness of the block, a single long breath that carried more than air in it. Then she finished her coffee and turned to face the building like the beginning of a conversation she'd been waiting to have. Jeremy arrived 20 minutes later with the lead contractor, a methodical man from a firm out of Milwaukee that specialized in historical commercial restoration, and with blueprints that Anne had not seen yet rolled under one arm. He handed them to her without preamble. "I didn't change the layout," he said. "I marked 3 structural upgrades for the kitchen, ventilation and suppression systems mostly, while you'll want to approve them before anything's finalized." She unrolled the plans against the hood of the car and studied them in the morning light, and felt something in her chest loosen fractionally, because the kitchen was exactly as it had been, her kitchen, her grandmother's floor plan, unchanged, just made safer. The difference between someone who helps you rebuild what you had and someone who quietly redesigns it was not a small one. "The suppression system," she said, pointing to the notations along the rear wall. "I want it extended to cover the full prep area, not just the range line." The contractor made a note without comment. She appreciated professionals who received corrections without theatre. Inside, the work had already begun to feel less like a wound and more like a project. There is a specific quality to a space, mid-renovation, that is not quite destruction, and not yet construction, raw and dusty, and smelling of cut lumber and plaster, of the bones of a room suddenly visible, which is simultaneously unsettling and clarifying. Anne moved through the gutted kitchen with the contractor, asking questions that demonstrated she already knew most of the answers, and Jeremy followed at a slight remove, watching without interjecting, present in the way that she had come to understand was simply how he operated. Not directing, not performing. Just there. Diane came by at noon with sandwiches and the reservation wait list, which had grown considerably since a sympathetic write-up about the fire had run in a Chicago food publication. "We're booked 12 weeks out the moment we reopen," Diane said, with the particular satisfaction of someone who had been running a dining room in crisis mode for weeks and was ready to return to running it in the usual mode, which was simply excellent. Anne sat on an overturned crate in the front dining room and reviewed the list, and for the first time in weeks felt the specific pleasure of a problem that was purely good. Too much demand, not enough seats. A restaurant that people missed so genuinely they had put their names on a list before the kitchen walls had been rebuilt. Her grandmother would have found that funny. She would have said something dry and warm about it that Anne would have remembered for years. Jeremy sat beside her, not on a crate, but on the floor with his back against the wall, which struck her as an unexpectedly unguarded posture for a man who commanded rooms for a living. He had his own paperwork. He always had his own paperwork, but he wasn't reading it. He was looking at the dining room with an expression she recognized now without effort. He was letting himself be somewhere, fully, without strategy. She folded the reservation list and looked at him. "The marriage?" she said. "The legal structure." Jeremy turned his head toward her. "Grayson says we can dissolve the formal arrangement quietly. There's no public filing required." She held his gaze with the steadiness that had carried her through broken glass and burned kitchens, and a dining room in Indianapolis, and a corridor outside a West Wing bedroom. "That's the clean exit if you want it." The contractor's crew moved in the kitchen behind them, the sounds of work filling the building, saws and voices, and the percussive knock of lumber being moved, the sounds of something being made. Jeremy looked at her for a long moment. "I don't want a clean exit," he said. The words were quiet and entirely unambiguous. No contract language, no clauses, no carefully maintained professional distance. Anne looked down at the reservation list in her hands, then at the photograph of her grandmother on the wall. Gloria Reader, aproned and laughing, standing in this exact doorway on the day the bistro first opened, 23 years of accumulated love held in a single frame. "I need this to be real," she said. "If it's something, it has to be something actual, not an arrangement, not mutually beneficial." She looked back at him. "I've spent my whole life being the most competent person in every room I've entered, and I have almost no experience with the alternative." "I know," Jeremy said. Something in his voice was careful and honest in equal measure. "Neither do I." A beat. Or then we're both learning, Anne said. He reached over and took the reservation list from her hands, not to read it, but simply to set it aside, clearing the space between them with the quiet deliberateness of a man who had made a decision and was not going to hedge it. His hand found hers on the dusty floor of her grandmother's bistro. She let it. Outside, Chicago went about its morning, relentless and indifferent and luminous as always, the city that had held Gloria's for 23 years and would hold it for 23 more. The contractors worked in the kitchen. Diane's voice floated in from the sidewalk, already on a call, already managing the future. Anne looked at the room around her, gutted and mid-becoming, and absolutely, irreversibly hers, and thought that this was how the best things began. Not with a signed contract or $1 million check on a mahogany bar, not with strategy or survival or the careful language of mutual benefit, but with two people sitting on the floor of something worth rebuilding, holding on and deciding, without a clause or a deadline or a lighter to hold over it, to begin again.